Blood dripped from the Lichen King's iron-tipped boots as he circled the trembling village girl. "She's deaf," her drunk father spat, kicking the frozen mud. A useless, broken thing. But the giant alpha didn't listen. He leaned in, his hot breath brushing her ear, and whispered, "I know you can hear." The medieval village of Dunwich was a place where hope went to freeze. Nestled at the jagged edge of the howling pines, it was a settlement of perpetual twilight and bone-chilling winds. Here, survival was the only currency, and for 20-year-old Isolde Ashford, survival meant absolute, unbreakable silence. Isolde was not born deaf. Her hearing was as sharp as the hunting blades forged in the village smithy. Yet, for 12 agonizing years, she had lived in a soundless prison of her own making. It was a psychological fortress, built on the night she turned 8, the night she hid beneath the floorboards and listened to the local magistrate, Lord Caelan, order the brutal execution of her mother for practicing forbidden herbalism. Isolde had learned a terrifying, real-life lesson that night. Hearing the truth got you killed. Reacting to the world made you a target. So, she went blank. She stopped reacting to the slamming of doors, the crack of thunder, and, most importantly, the drunken, violent ravings of her father, Garrick Ashford. Garrick was a man hollowed out by cheap ale and chronic gambling debts. He was a creature of pathetic cruelties, taking out his life's failures on his silent daughter. On this particular bleak winter morning, Garrick stumbled out of the local tavern, his breath a noxious cloud of fermented barley and rot. Isolde was by the woodpile, her calloused hands gripping a rusted axe. She swung it down, splitting a heavy log of pine. She heard his clumsy, dragging footsteps approaching behind her. She heard the wet slop of his boots in the mud. But true to the discipline that had kept her alive, her rhythm didn't falter. She didn't flinch until his heavy hand clamped onto her shoulder, yanking her backward. She let out a fabricated gasp of surprise, staring at him with wide, vacant eyes, pointing to her ears in the pathetic, helpless gesture she had perfected over a decade. "Stop your chopping, you useless mute!" Garrick bellowed, his spittle flying across her cold-chapped face. He knew she couldn't hear him, or so he believed, but he yelled anyway. A man desperate to feel big in a world that constantly reminded him he was small. "The collectors are coming. The Blood Moon Pack. They're crossing the ridge." Isolde's heart gave a violent, treacherous leap against her ribs, but her face remained a mask of dull confusion. The Blood Moon Pack. They were not mere tax collectors. They were apex predators. Ruled by King Valerius, a giant among lichens, they controlled the entire northern territory. They did not deal in gold or silver. They dealt in tithes of flesh, livestock, and labor to fuel their eternal border wars. A heavy, resonant horn blasted through the frigid air, shaking the snow from the thatched roofs of Dunwich. The sound was so loud it vibrated in Isolde's teeth. The villagers poured into the muddy town square, their faces pale with terror. Garrick's grip on Isolde's arm tightened to a bruising point as he dragged her toward the gathering crowd. He owed 300 silver pieces to the local gambling dens, a debt bought out by the pack's quartermasters. If he didn't pay today, they would strip the flesh from his bones. Through the mist, the procession emerged. Massive dire wolves, the size of draft horses, stalked at the vanguard. Behind them rode the lichen elite, men and women of terrifying beauty and lethal grace, clad in dark furs and boiled leather. And then there was the king. King Valerius rode a monstrous black stallion that looked ready to snap under his immense weight. He was a towering force of nature, standing nearly 7 feet tall even when dismounted. His face was a rugged landscape of aristocratic bone structure and savage scars, a jagged white line cutting across his left eye, a testament to 100 battles survived. His eyes were the color of molten amber, sharp, calculating, and cold enough to freeze the blood in a man's veins. He dismounted with a heavy thud that seemed to echo through the very bedrock of Dunwich. The villagers dropped to their knees in the mud. Isolde was yanked down by her father, her knees sinking into the freezing slush. She kept her head bowed, her eyes fixed entirely on the puddle in front of her. "Be a stone," she told herself. "Be nothing. Be deaf. Be dumb. Be invisible." Valerius began to walk the line of groveling peasants. His beta, a hulking warrior named Auric, flanked him with a parchment scroll of ledgers. Garrick Ashford. Oric's voice boomed, a gravelly sound that made the villagers whimper. Debt. 300 silver. Overdue by 3 moons. Garrick scrambled forward on his knees, his hands clasped in desperate supplication. My king, my lord, I beg of you, the winter has been cruel. The crops failed, the game is scarce. The pack cares nothing for your excuses, human, Valerius interrupted. His voice was a deep, chest-rattling baritone. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a quiet, absolute authority that commanded the air itself to be still. You have no coin. You have no livestock. Your life is forfeit. Wait! Garrick shrieked, his voice cracking with cowardice. He scrambled backward and grabbed Isolde by the hood of her threadbare cloak, dragging her forward and throwing her at the giant king's feet. Take her. Take my daughter. She's young. She's strong. She can scrub the floors of your great halls. She can work the kitchens. Her life for mine. A fair trade. A murmur of disgust rippled through the gathered lichens. Even to monsters, the cowardice of a father selling his own child was a sickening scent. Isolde lay in the mud, her breath coming in shallow, controlled bursts. She stared at the massive, steel-capped boots of the Alpha King. She did not look up. She played her part. She was deaf. She had heard none of the betrayal, none of the bargaining. Valerius stared down at the small, ragged heap at his feet. His amber eyes narrowed. The silence in the village square stretched, taut, and fragile as a bowstring. King Valerius did not immediately respond to Garrick's pathetic offer. Instead, he tilted his massive head, his nostrils flaring slightly as he took in the scent of the frightened human girl at his boots. Look at her! Garrick urged, mistaking the king's silence for consideration. He reached out and kicked Isolde sharply in the ribs. Isolde let out a grunt of pain, but she did not turn to look at her father. She simply curled tighter into a ball, keeping her eyes unfocused, staring blankly at the hem of the king's fur-lined cloak. She's deaf, the drunk father shouted, his voice echoing off the dilapidated wooden hovels. He waved a dismissive, trembling hand at her. Deaf and dumb since she was a brat. A useless, broken thing. But her hands work fine. She'll labor until she drops. She won't complain. She can't. Take her and wipe my ledger clean. Oric, the beta, sneered, stepping forward. We are the Blood Moon Pack, peasant. We do not run an asylum for broken humans. We need strong blood, capable servants. This one looks like a stiff wind would break her spine. Please, Garrick sobbed, pressing his forehead into the mud. Valerius raised a single massive hand, silencing his beta instantly. The giant Alpha King slowly crouched down. Even crouched, he was imposing, a mountain of muscle and lethal intent. The sheer heat radiating off his body was palpable, a stark contrast to the freezing winter air. Isolde felt his presence like a physical weight pressing down on her. Her instincts screamed at her to scramble away, to run for the tree line, but her mind maintained the iron discipline of a survivor. She kept her breathing even, her eyes completely devoid of comprehension. She acted exactly as a deaf girl would startled by the sudden shadow, but unaware of the violent conversation happening just inches above her head. Valerius reached out, his hand, easily twice the size of hers, heavily calloused and ending in slightly pointed nails, gently grasped her chin. Isolde gasped, a perfect performance of shock, and finally brought her eyes to meet his. Up close, the king was terrifying. The jagged scar across his eye pulled his skin tight, but his amber eyes held a terrifying depth of intellect. He wasn't just looking at her face, he was looking through her. He was watching the micro-expressions, the dilation of her pupils, the subtle flutter of the pulse at her throat. Lichens possessed superhuman senses, and Valerius was the most powerful among them. He studied her for 3 agonizing seconds. Then he leaned in. His face was so close, the coarse fur of his cloak brushed her cheek. His hot breath, smelling of pine and raw power, ghosted over her ear. I know you can hear, Valerius whispered. The words were so soft, barely a vibration in the air, undetectable to anyone else in the square, but to Isolde, they struck like a warhammer to the chest. Despite 12 years of flawless acting, her body betrayed her. Her heart, previously beating at a controlled, frightened rhythm, instantly spiked into a frantic, terrified gallop. Her pupils blew wide open in sheer panic. For a fraction of a second, the mask slipped, and raw, comprehending terror bled into her eyes. Valerius's lips curled into a slow, terrifyingly handsome smirk. The spike in her heartbeat was all the confirmation he needed. He released her chin and stood up, his massive frame unfurling to its full, intimidating height. "I will take her," Valerius declared, his voice ringing out across the square. Garrick let out a loud, sobbing gasp of relief, practically kissing the mud. "Oh, thank you, my lord. You are merciful. The debt is clear?" "The debt is clear," Valerius said coldly. He didn't even glance at the pathetic man. He kept his amber eyes locked on Isolde, who was still kneeling in the mud, her mind spinning in absolute freefall. He knows my secret. "He's going to kill me," Auric, Valerius commanded. "Put her in my personal carriage." A shockwave of murmurs swept through both the villagers and the Lycan warriors. The king's personal carriage? A filthy, broken human peasant? Auric looked openly stunned, but knew better than to question his alpha in public. "Yes, my king," Auric rumbled. He reached down and hoisted Isolde to her feet with one hand, as easily as if she were a rag doll. Isolde did not fight. She couldn't. Her entire world had just been violently upended by 6 whispered words. She stumbled alongside the massive beta, her mind racing. Why didn't he expose her? Why was the Alpha King putting a human slave in his private transport? She was shoved roughly into a massive, iron-reinforced carriage lined with dark velvet and thick bear pelts. The door slammed shut behind her, plunging her into luxurious darkness. Minutes later, the carriage rocked violently as the massive weight of King Valerius boarded. He sat across from her, taking up the entirety of the opposite bench. As the procession began to move, the iron-rimmed wheels rolling out of Dunwich, the silence in the carriage grew suffocating. Isolde stared at her muddy knees, shivering in her thin cloak, waiting for the axe to fall. "You can drop the charade, Isolde of House Ashford," Valerius said, his voice dropping the formal, booming tone he used in public, settling into a smooth, dangerous purr. Isolde flinched. He knew her name. He knew her full name, a name her father hadn't used in over a decade, a name that belonged to a disgraced bloodline. Still, she bit her tongue. To speak now would be to surrender her last shield. She pointed to her ears and shook her head, tears welling in her eyes, a final, desperate play at the deception. Valerius chuckled. It was a dark, rumbling sound that vibrated through the floorboards. "Stubborn little thing. Your heart rate spiked to 140 beats per minute when I whispered in your ear. Your pupils dilated. And now, you are holding your breath, waiting for my reaction. I am a Lycan king. You cannot lie to my senses." He leaned forward, his elbows resting on his massive knees. "But what fascinates me is why? Why a human girl would subject herself to 12 years of utter silence, enduring beatings and starvation, just to appear broken. And, more importantly, Valerius reached into his cloak and pulled out a small silver dagger. With a sudden, blindingly fast motion, he grabbed Isolde's wrist and pressed the flat of the silver blade against her palm. Isolde cried out a real, vocalized gasp of pain as the silver hissed against her skin, burning her like hot coals. She yanked her hand back, cradling the blistering burn against her chest, her eyes blazing with sudden, unmasked fury as she stared at the king. "There it is," Valerius murmured, his amber eyes glowing in the dim carriage. "Silver burns a human, yes, but it does not hiss. It does not react to human blood. You are no peasant, Isolde. You carry the dormant blood of the White Fang, the ancient, royal Lycan line my ancestors supposedly wiped out a century ago. You aren't just faking deafness to survive your father. You're hiding from us." The silver dagger clattered to the wooden floorboards of the carriage, but the hissing sound seemed to echo in the confined space. Isolde clutched her blistering palm to her chest, her breathing ragged. The mask of the deaf, dumb, and dim-witted village girl was entirely shattered. In its place sat a terrifyingly alert survivor, her chest heaving, her eyes burning with a desperate, cornered fury. "You are insane," Isolde finally spoke. Her voice was a harsh, agonizing rasp. It sounded like two stones grinding together, brittle and entirely unused. It physically hurt her throat to force the words out after 12 years of absolute, unbroken silence, but the sheer shock of his accusation demanded it. "I am a human. My father is a drunken gambler. My mother was a peasant." King Valerius leaned back against the plush velvet of the carriage, completely unfazed by her hostility. In fact, a dark, primal satisfaction glimmered in his amber eyes. "Your father is Garrick Ashford, yes," Valerius rumbled, his voice a smooth baritone that vibrated through the floorboards. "A pathetic, weak-blooded human. But your mother, her name was not merely a peasant's moniker. She was Evangeline, the last documented descendant of the White Fang." Isolde's heart skipped a beat, but she forced her face into a scowl. "She was an herbalist. The magistrate executed her for making poultices." The magistrate, Lord Kalen, executed her because he discovered what she was, and he was terrified. Valerius corrected smoothly. He reached out, his massive, calloused fingers gently wrapping around her uninjured wrist. He didn't pull her closer, but the heat of his touch was undeniable. The White Fangs were a royal lichen bloodline. They were not cursed by the moon. They were blessed by it. They did not shift into mindless beasts. They retained their humanity, but possessed senses and strength that rivaled the gods. My ancestors, the Blood Moons, slaughtered them 3 centuries ago in a war of pure jealousy. Centuries later, private historical journals recovered from a British scholar named Richard Montgomery would suggest this exact genetic anomaly, a lineage immune to silver, with heightened physiological traits, was a documented, real-life phenomenon hidden within isolated European families, making the legend of the White Fang terrifyingly grounded in reality. Isolde stared at the giant lichen, her mind reeling. "If I am a monster," she whispered hoarsely, "why don't I have fur? Why don't I have claws? Why did I freeze in the mud while my father beat me?" "Because Evangeline bound your wolf," Valerius said softly. The cruelty in his eyes had vanished, replaced by a strange, heavy sorrow. "She knew the Blood Moon Pack would hunt you if they sensed your aura. She fed you a continuous draft of wolfsbane and ironweed from the day you were born. It suppressed your nature. It made you human. But she couldn't suppress your instincts. She couldn't suppress your hearing. And she couldn't suppress your blood's reaction to pure silver." Isolde looked down at her hand. The burn was already fading. Normal human skin would have blistered and scarred for weeks. Hers was knitting itself back together, leaving only a faint pink mark. A sob hitched in her throat as the reality of her mother's sacrifice and her father's profound, ignorant cruelty crashed over her. "Why didn't you expose me in the square?" Isolde asked, her voice trembling, finally allowing her vulnerability to show. "Why pay my father's debt and bring me here?" Valerius slowly closed the distance between them. He was so massive, he completely eclipsed the moonlight filtering through the carriage window. He reached out, and with a surprising, terrifying gentleness, he tucked a stray lock of dirt-caked hair behind her ear. "Because, Isolde," he breathed, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "The moment I stepped into that filthy village square, before I even saw you, my wolf went completely insane. The scent of you, it smells like rain on hot stones. It smells like home." Isolde's eyes went wide. She knew the folklore. She knew the lichen laws. "A mate." "My mate," Valerius confirmed, his amber eyes burning with a fierce, possessive fire. "But I rule a court of vipers. My beta, Auric, is loyal, but the regional lords are constantly plotting. If I brought you to the keep and announced you were my fated mate, a human peasant, they would assassinate you to protect the bloodline. If I announced you were the last White Fang, they would execute you out of ancient fear." He pulled back slightly, his expression hardening into the calculating mask of a warlord. "So, we play a game, Isolde. You have spent 12 years playing the perfect, silent fool. You have convinced your own father You are deaf and dumb. Can you convince a castle full of lichens?" Isolde's jaw tightened. The fear that had gripped her for over a decade suddenly mutated. It wasn't fear anymore, it was adrenaline. She had hidden under the floorboards to survive. Now, she was being asked to hide in plain sight to conquer. "You want me to be your spy," she rasped, her lips curving into a very small, very dangerous smile. "I want you to be my shadow," Valerius said, extending his massive hand. "They will ignore the broken, deaf humans scrubbing their floors. They will speak their treasons freely in front of you. You will be my ears, Isolde, and when the time is right, I will unleash you, and we will burn the traitors out of my court." Isolde looked at his hand. It was an offer of treason, danger, and unimaginable power. She placed her small, calloused hand into his. "I won't just be your ears, Valerius. If they threaten you, I will be the blade in the dark." The Blood Moon Keep was a jagged fortress of black iron and obsidian stone, piercing the storm clouds like a spear. To the outside world, Isolde was nothing but a pitiful addition to the castle's labor force. She wore the drab, rough-spun gray wool of the scullery maids. She kept her head bowed, her eyes vacant, and her face devoid of all comprehension. For 3 months, the deception worked flawlessly. The lichen nobility were creatures of immense arrogance. They possessed hearing sharp enough to hear a mouse heartbeat in the walls, yet their pride blinded them to the human girl sweeping the grand halls. Because she did not react to sudden noises, because she never flinched when they roared in anger, they completely dismissed her existence. Isolde became a ghost, and as a ghost, she heard everything. She heard the stewards skimming gold from the winter tithes. She heard the guards complaining about the weaknesses in the eastern watchtower. But most importantly, she heard Lady Morgana. Morgana was an alpha female of a rival northern clan, a woman of striking, icy beauty and ruthless ambition. She sought the title of queen, and she despised Valerius's refusal to take a mate from the highborn lines. It was the eve of the Blood Moon Festival, a massive banquet attended by every regional lord. The great hall was a cacophony of roaring fires, roasted meats, and raucous lichen laughter. Isolde was tasked with pouring wine, moving silently between the heavy oak tables. As she approached the high table where Valerius sat, stoic and imposing, she felt the familiar, thrilling brush of his aura. He did not look at her, but she saw the microscopic relaxation of his shoulders as she poured his goblet. Their secret communication had become a lifeline. Late at night, in the hidden alcoves of the castle, he would teach her to fight, and she would give him the names of his enemies. Isolde stepped back, fading into the shadows near a heavy velvet tapestry. On the other side of the stone pillar, Lady Morgana stood conversing with Lord Alaric, the commander of the northern garrisons. Isolde slowed her breathing, tuning out the roaring laughter of the hall, focusing her unnatural, suppressed white fang hearing on the whispering voices 10 feet away. "The wolfsbane extract is in the venison gravy," Morgana hissed, her voice barely a breath. "It is concentrated. It will not kill him instantly, but it will paralyze his nervous system. When he collapses, you declare a challenge for the throne. He will be too weak to fight. You take his head, and I take my place as your queen." "Are you certain the human cannot hear us?" Alaric whispered back, his heavy boots shifting nervously. "The mute?" Morgana scoffed softly. "I dropped a heavy silver tray right behind her yesterday. She didn't even blink. She's a broken plaything. Now, prepare yourself. The servers are bringing the main course." Isolde's blood turned to ice. She looked toward the heavy double doors of the kitchens. A line of servants was marching out, carrying massive iron platters of roasted venison, thick with dark, rich gravy. They were heading straight for the high table. There was no time to pull Valerius away. There was no time to write a note. Isolde stepped out from the shadows. She didn't walk with the shuffling, hesitant gait of a deaf maid. She walked with the sudden, terrifying grace of a predator. As the lead servant approached Valerius's table, raising the heavy platter of venison, Isolde lunged. She didn't just push the servant. 12 years of suppressed white fang strength, fueled by sheer adrenaline and the terrified instinct to protect her mate, exploded through her veins. Isolde grabbed the edge of the boiling hot iron platter with her bare hands. She felt the flesh of her palms sear, but she didn't care. She violently ripped the platter from the servant's grip and hurled it across the room. The heavy iron crashed into the grand fireplace with an ear-splitting boom. Venison and poisoned gravy splattered across the blazing logs, immediately emitting a foul, acrid green smoke, the unmistakable chemical reaction of cooked wolfsbane. The entire great hall fell into a dead, stunned silence. 300 lichen warriors stared in absolute shock at the tiny human maid standing before the king's table, her hands blistered, her chest heaving. "Guards!" Lady Morgana shrieked, recovering her wits, pointing a perfectly manicured finger at Isolde. "The human has gone mad! She attacked the king's meal! Tear her to pieces!" 2 massive guards shifted into their half-wolf forms, their claws extending, snarling as they lunged toward Isolde. Isolde didn't cower. She didn't point to her ears. She stood tall, squared her shoulders, and opened her mouth. "Touch me!" Isolde roared. Her voice wasn't raspy anymore. It tore through the hall with the concussive force of a thunderclap. It was a voice layered with a strange, reverberating subharmonic dominance that forced every lichen in the room, including the charging guards, to physically flinch and drop to their knees. The sheer, commanding power of the White Fang alpha tone echoed off the obsidian walls. As she spoke, the suppression seal in her blood finally broke. Her dull, brown human eyes flooded with a blinding, luminescent silver light. The illusion of the frail peasant was gone. Valerius stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a terrifying shadow over the room. He bypassed the kneeling guards and walked to Isolde. He gently took her burned hands in his, uncaring of the gasps from his court. "She is not deaf," King Valerius announced, his voice dark and lethal, laced with absolute fury as he glared at Morgana and Alaric. "And she is no mere human. She is Isolde of the White Fang, and she just heard you plotting treason." Morgana's face drained of all color. She stumbled backward, bumping into Alaric, who was already drawing his sword in a desperate panic. "Kill them," Valerius commanded Auric, not even bothering to look at the traitors. The sounds of violence erupted in the back of the hall, but Valerius only had eyes for Isolde. He lifted her injured, blistering hands and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the lichen healing properties in his saliva immediately soothing her burns. "You broke your silence," he whispered, a fierce, proud smile gracing his scarred face. "They were going to hurt you," Isolde replied, her voice now smooth, powerful, and deeply resonant. The silver light in her eyes locked with his molten amber. "I listened to the world break me for 12 years, Valerius. I'm done listening. From now on, they listen to us." The Alpha King dropped to one knee before the entire blood-soaked court, bowing his head to the girl who was no longer a victim, but a queen. Did Isolde's incredible journey from a silent, abused girl to the powerful White Fang Queen leave you absolutely breathless? Don't miss out on more thrilling werewolf romance, intense drama, and epic plot twists. If you loved this story, please hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fantasy lovers, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing daily tales. Comment below, what was your favorite twist?